Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Audio Classic Detective, your home for refined mystery and masterful deduction. Here we revive the golden age of crime fiction where every motive is masked, every alibi tested, and only the keenest minds prevail. So settle in, brew a proper cup of tea, and prepare for clever crimes and even cleverer solutions. The investigation is about to begin. Let's get started. It was a crisp spring afternoon in St. Mary, Mead, the kind that painted the hedgerows in soft green and tempted birds into premature songs. Miss Jane Marple sat by the parlor window, a china cup of Darjeeling balanced neatly on its saucer, and a half-knitted baby bonnet resting in her lap. Though her needles were idle at present, her mind was quietly alert, as it always was. From her small writing desk, she had just retrieved a letter from her niece, young Raymond's wife, Joan. It was written on thick cream paper in a light, artistic hand, and bore the faintest scent of violets. Miss Marple read it slowly, sipping her tea, her pale blue eyes narrowing slightly at a particular passage. "You must meet him, Aunt Jane." The letter read, "Sir Cedric Dalloway. He's quite the rage in London now. Florence Gresham has invited him to stay at Gresham Hall for a culinary presentation at the fete. He's promised to unveil a secret recipe that's positively to die for. His words, not mine." Miss Marple's lips tightened ever so slightly. She had lived long enough to know that words, especially careless ones, sometimes carried more truth than their speakers intended. Lady Florence Gresham was not the sort of woman to be easily ignored, particularly when it came to social spectacle. Since her husband's passing the previous autumn, she had thrown herself into village society with new vigor, hosting poetry readings, musical recitals, and now, in what many considered a rather theatrical gesture, inviting London's most flamboyant chef to St. Mary Mead. Sir Cedric Dalloway was a man of culinary legend, tall, silver-haired, and known as much for his dramatic flair as for his risottos. He had once flambéed a lobster at Buckingham Palace, or so the stories claimed. And now he would descend upon the quiet Berkshire village, bringing with him what he called gastronomic theatre. Lady Florence had arranged for Sir Cedric to stay an entire fortnight at Gresham Hall in preparation for the village fete. The centerpiece, of course, would be his demonstration of a secret ancient recipe he claimed to have discovered during his time in Naples. The dish, he said, would stir the senses, provoke the soul, and, he added with a mischievous twinkle, just might kill a man. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow when she heard that. Such remarks, she knew, were rarely as innocent as they sounded. By the following Monday the village was humming with gossip, at the greengrocer's, in the pews before Sunday service, and over sliced Battenberg at the Women's Institute. Sir Cedric's forthcoming appearance had eclipsed all other subjects. The butcher's wife declared that she had once seen him on television, flambeing a duck with brandy, while old Mr. Merriweather grumbled that nothing good ever came of food that smoked like a chimney. But what truly set tongues wagging was the rumor, spread by the vicar's daughter, no less, that Sir Cedric's secret recipe had been banned in parts of Europe for its potentially overwhelming effects. No one could explain what that meant precisely, but it was enough to make the upcoming fete the most anticipated event since the bishop's visit in 1932. Miss Marple, meanwhile, observed it all with mild amusement and the faintest crease of concern. The excitement felt just a little too fevered, and in her long experience, where there was smoke, there was often more than flambéed duck. The day of the fete dawned crisp and clear, with a sky the color of bluebells and the scent of fresh-cut grass drifting across the vicarage green. Bunting fluttered in soft hues above the stalls, and the entire village had turned out in their Sunday best, There were jams and preserves, a quilting competition, and even a modest brass band whose performance veered charmingly out of tune. But all eyes were drawn to the centerpiece of the afternoon, Sir Cedric Dalloway's culinary tent. It was a grand affair, complete with gleaming copper pans, elegant white linens, and a small raised platform where the chef himself stood, resplendent in a tailored apron, with a flourish of silver hair and theatrical mannerisms that delighted the ladies and confounded the gentlemen. The dish he presented was nothing short of a spectacle. Risotto della Morte, a creamy herb-laced concoction prepared with grand gestures and whispered flourishes. When it was finally plated and offered to a handful of local dignitaries, including Lady Florence and the retired Colonel Tobias Redfern, the crowd leaned in as if witnessing a royal proclamation. Colonel Redfern, ever the skeptic, made a remark about continental nonsense before scooping a generous mouthful. Mere moments later he staggered, grasped at his chest, and crumpled to the ground, his face a ghastly shade of gray. Gasps filled the air. A scream rang out from behind the cake stall. The fete dissolved into chaos, as cries of, "Fetch a doctor," and "He's not breathing," rose in panic. In the swirl of alarm, most villagers clustered in shock or scrambled to assist. Miss Marple, however, did not move from her seat near the edge of the tent, her eyes pale and unassuming behind their spectacles, flicked not to the fallen colonel but to the preparation table. Sir Cedric stood pale and trembling, wringing his hands in horror, repeating over and over, "It was just saffron, nothing harmful." The constable on duty tried to calm the crowd while someone was sent running to Dr. Griffith's house. Miss Marple's gaze settled on a peculiar absence. The small lidded salt container that had sat by Sir Cedric's elbow only moments before was now nowhere to be seen. In its place, a faint dusting of pale residue shimmered on the white cloth. She noted this silently, her fingers tightening slightly around the handle of her handbag. Just beyond the culinary station, a young maid stood frozen, her complexion chalk white, her hands wringing the hem of her apron. Millie Dawson, if Miss Marple recalled correctly, quiet, unobtrusive, and rarely noticed. But today Miss Marple noticed everything, especially the slight tremor in Millie's jaw and the wide-eyed look of someone who had seen, or done, far more than she would admit. As the villagers dispersed in clusters of confusion and conjecture, Miss Marple remained seated, quietly knitting the row she had left unfinished. But her thoughts were far from wool and yarn. Dr. Griffith arrived promptly, and after a tense examination, confirmed the colonel was dead. "Likely heart failure," he muttered gravely, though the timing was too precise for coincidence. The constable asked a few questions. Sir Cedric continued his protests of innocence, and Lady Florence was led away in fainting distress. Miss Marple observed each of them in turn, not their words, but their silences. The way Sir Cedric glanced, not at the fallen man, but at the food. The way Lady Florence's hands trembled as she reached for her gloves. And most of all, the way Millie Dawson had slipped away when the attention had turned elsewhere. The dish had been sampled by several people, yet only the colonel had reacted. That, in itself, was telling. Miss Marple folded her knitting with quiet deliberation. In her long life, she had often noted that evil wore many disguises, but rarely did it arrive so finely plated, or with such a delicate touch of nutmeg. And so, beneath the spring sunshine and fluttering bunting, suspicion had quietly taken root. By evening, the announcement was made official. Colonel Tobias Redfern was dead. Dr. Griffith, though visibly uncomfortable under the weight of speculation, concluded the cause as likely cardiac failure, possibly triggered by stress or indigestion. He added with an apologetic frown. The villagers accepted this with murmured uncertainty, for the colonel, though not young, had always seemed robust. His military posture, his brisk walks through the churchyard, his weekly attendance at the billiards club, none of it spoke of a man near collapse. Miss Marple, seated quietly with a pot of chamomile tea at her side, did not challenge the verdict aloud. Yet behind her gentle expression, her mind moved swiftly. She had known the colonel for nearly 20 years. He had served 3 regiments and 2 marriages, without once yielding to anything resembling fragility. Nor, to her knowledge, had he ever been troubled by his heart. What unsettled her most, however, was not the medical diagnosis, but the timing. A healthy man collapses mere moments after tasting a dish flamboyantly named risotto della morte, and it is dismissed as indigestion. She reviewed the scene in her mind: the misplaced salt shaker, Millie's blanching face, Cedric's overly dramatic protestations. There had been something too theatrical about the way things had unfolded, as though carefully staged. Miss Marple had no intention of confronting anyone just yet, but she had learned long ago that murder rarely shouted its presence. More often it whispered, through inconsistencies, small oversights, and things not said. The next morning, Miss Marple set out for Gresham Hall. She brought with her a small pot of quince jelly and the gentlest tone of maternal concern. Lady Florence, though visibly shaken, welcomed her with gratitude. "My dear Miss Marple," she said with a tremulous smile, "how kind of you to come. I'm afraid the whole thing has quite unstrung me." Miss Marple patted her hand soothingly. "It is a dreadful shock, my dear. I always say that death at a fete seems quite out of place, don't you agree?" Lady Florence dabbed at her eyes. "Tobias was not a kind man, but I never wished him harm. This scandal, well, the London papers have already telephoned." The drawing-room smelled faintly of lilies and beeswax, and Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the Morning Post on a side table. 2 envelopes opened, one still sealed. She made no comment, but stored the detail away. "I was wondering," she said gently, "whether you happened to be near the culinary tent during the tasting. I imagine things were rather chaotic." Lady Florence looked momentarily puzzled. "I did sample the dish, but only a spoonful. I recall Tobias grumbling about foreign slop. Then suddenly he was on the ground. I was so flustered." Miss Marple nodded, her voice low and kind. "It's often not what people do that reveals the truth, but how they remembered doing it." And in Lady Florence's face, she detected a flicker, not of guilt, perhaps, but of someone hiding more than she wished to admit. Sir Cedric received Miss Marple in the conservatory, where he was nursing a glass of sherry and lamenting the loss of his reputation, brand, and possibly career. He wore a silk cravat and a robe that suggested more theatre than domesticity. "An absolute tragedy, Miss Marple," he exclaimed, gesturing widely. "A man dies after tasting my food. The Daily Chronicle will have a field day. And Florence, well, she's already cancelled the second demonstration." "I'm sure it's all just a misunderstanding," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But I do wonder, do you usually keep your ingredients accessible to others?" He stiffened. "Certainly not. I am meticulous. My spices are locked, my sauces are labeled. I even prepare the reductions myself. No one else touched that risotto, except perhaps Millie, and only to fetch the spoons." "Millie Dawson?" Miss Marple asked, feigning mild interest. "Yes, the maid. Quiet girl. Never speaks. But then, who does in a kitchen?" Miss Marple let that pass. "I did notice your salt container was missing during the commotion." Cedric's brow furrowed. "Was it? Curious. I always place it to my left." "Because you're left-handed, I suppose." He looked surprised. "Naturally. Most chefs are rather particular about muscle memory." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Quite right. Habits once formed are difficult to break." She took her leave a few minutes later, her tone as polite as ever, but her mind was already assembling fragments: locked spice racks, a left-handed chef, a quiet maid, a misplaced salt shaker. The dish might have been extravagant, but the details were what truly mattered. Miss Marple found Lady Florence alone in the orangery later that afternoon, fussing over a bowl of camellias that didn't seem to require her attention. Her posture was immaculate, her pearls gleaming in the soft light, but her fingers trembled slightly as they rearranged petals already in perfect order. "I fear I must apologize again for the dreadful business," Lady Florence said without looking up. "I had no idea a fete could become so perilous." Miss Marple responded kindly. "It was no fault of yours, my dear. But I wonder, were you and Colonel Redfern on good terms of late?" Florence hesitated, one manicured hand pausing in midair. Tobias was difficult, blunt. He didn't care for Sir Cedric's presence, thought it all nonsense. He said it cheapened the dignity of the whole. Her voice dropped. "And he was never shy about expressing such views, loudly." Miss Marple offered a small understanding nod. "Some men are like that. They mistake control for propriety." Florence allowed herself a small bitter smile. "He once called me a frivolous widow chasing headlines." "Ah," said Miss Marple, as if discussing the weather. "And yet you allowed him to sample Sir Cedric's dish." "I couldn't stop him," Florence replied tightly. "Tobias did as he pleased, always." The scent of camellias lingered as Miss Marple rose. She didn't yet know the truth, but she knew grief when it was genuine, and resentment when it had aged into something else entirely. Dorothy Redfern was not by nature a dramatic girl. Pale, composed, and seemingly resigned to a life of quiet compliance, she had long dwelt in her uncle's shadow, until perhaps now. Miss Marple found her seated in the back garden of the Redfern cottage, hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry to intrude," Miss Marple said gently, "but I thought you might wish for some company." Dorothy looked up, eyes distant. "There's been so much of that lately. People pretending to care when they're just curious." Miss Marple didn't bristle. "Curiosity is natural, but so is kindness. Your uncle's death must have been complicated." Dorothy gave a short, bitter laugh. "He controlled everything. My allowance, my future, even whom I was permitted to speak to. He said Henry, my fiancé, was after my money." She paused. "There isn't even that much." "And yet you stayed," Miss Marple observed. "I had nowhere else to go." Her voice cracked, then steadied. "But I'm not sorry he's gone. Does that make me wicked?" "No, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "It makes you honest." The girl blinked, surprised by the lack of judgment. Miss Marple smiled kindly, but her mind was already turning. Dorothy had motive, certainly. But motive was never quite enough. It was whether one had the opportunity and the heart to act on it. The Reverend James Allerton prided himself on being a man of order, his sermons carefully written, his garden precisely trimmed, his conscience clear. But when Miss Marple called upon him that evening, she noted a rare crack in that calm facade. "I'm afraid I can't offer much, Miss Marple," he said, as he poured her a modest cup of tea. "I wasn't near the culinary tent when it happened. I was inspecting the donations table." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Quite understandable. A tragic accident." The vicar flinched. "Yes, tragic. You and Colonel Redfern were not especially close, were you?" she asked lightly. His grip on the teapot tightened. He made certain suggestions about parish finances. Unfounded, I assure you." Miss Marple nodded as though finances were as dull as dust. "People do so love to stir things. Did he ever threaten to report you?" The Reverend looked briefly uncomfortable. "He insinuated as much, but there was nothing improper, I assure you. I simply redirected funds to assist the poor during winter, without filing the formal request through the diocese. A technicality." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. "Bureaucracy can be such a bore." She left shortly after, offering her usual pleasantries. But she had noted the beads of sweat on the vicar's brow, the defensiveness behind his carefully chosen words. He had reason to fear the colonel. That much was clear. But whether that fear extended to murder, well, that remained to be seen. The scullery at Gresham Hall was quiet when Miss Marple returned the next morning, save for the steady rhythm of a mop slapping against the tiled floor. Millie Dawson looked up at the sound of her footsteps, eyes wide and startled. "Good morning, Millie," Miss Marple said kindly. "I do hope I'm not in the way." The girl shook her head, returning wordlessly to her task. Miss Marple waited a moment before continuing. "It must have been dreadful, what happened at the fete. You were quite close to the preparation table, I believe." Millie froze, just slightly. I only brought the cutlery. Sir Cedric doesn't like anyone near his spices." "I've heard he's quite particular," Miss Marple agreed. "Do you happen to know where he keeps the salt?" Millie looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Always to the left of his station. He said it was muscle memory." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said gently. "But at the fete, it was missing." Millie swallowed hard. "I don't know what happened, miss. I didn't touch it." Miss Marple studied her, shoulders hunched, fingers clenched, eyes avoiding contact. Not guilt, perhaps, but fear. And fear, she knew, was often the shadow of something more complex. "Don't worry, child," she said softly. "Truth has a way of rising to the surface, like cream." And with that, she left the girl alone with her mop and her conscience. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple lingered in the kitchen under the pretext of delivering a new sponge cake recipe to the cook. While pleasantries were exchanged, her eyes wandered to the open shelf where Sir Cedric's personal recipe book sat, thick, well-thumbed, its pages covered in neat copperplate. A casual glance revealed what she had suspected. The section marked Risotto Variations had a page missing, torn out cleanly at the spine, not dog-eared, not smudged, but missing. She made no comment, merely noted the absence and tucked the observation away. The cook was prattling on about soufflés when Miss Marple finally excused herself, smiling sweetly as she left. To most, a missing page might suggest carelessness, or even theft. But to Miss Marple, who had once solved a murder by noticing the absence of dust on a bookshelf, it was something more deliberate. A page removed, her recipe altered, a man dead. Yes, she thought, the recipe that could kill a man might not have begun in Cedric's flamboyant imagination, but in someone else's quiet, premeditated hand. Though the kitchen at Gresham Hall had returned to its usual rhythm, saucepans bubbling, spoons clinking against bowls, Miss Marple found herself drawn once more to its quiet corners. It was not uncommon, in her experience, for the answer to a riddle to lie not in what was present, but in what had been hastily removed. A casual conversation with the cook about baking temperatures led her to the stove, where she noted a faint, acrid scent that had no business lingering after a fruit tart. With a tactful word and a gentle smile, she opened the lower chamber of the old cast-iron range. Inside, tucked among the gray ashes, was the blackened scrap of what had once been a recipe. Miss Marple, careful not to disturb the surrounding cinders too much, used the edge of a wooden spoon to draw it closer. The writing was mostly charred away, but one word, courgette, stood out, just visible in the top margin. She pondered this quietly. Sir Cedric's risotto had contained no such ingredient, nor had any dish prepared that day mentioned it. A red herring, perhaps. Or had someone deliberately destroyed a different recipe to confuse the timeline? Whatever its intent, the burned fragment served only to deepen the mystery. It was a clue, yes, but one not quite meant to be followed. And that, Miss Marple thought, made it all the more interesting. Among the villagers, few had missed the simmering tension between Colonel Redfern and his niece. Dorothy, though soft-spoken, had long been under her uncle's watchful and exacting eye. He had by all accounts treated her more as an unpaid housekeeper than a relative. The day before the fete, witnesses had overheard the colonel chastising her sharply outside the post office. A disagreement, they said, over her intention to leave for London with her fiancé. Dorothy had reportedly replied with a rare note of steel in her voice, "I won't live in this house forever." Now, with the colonel gone, tongues wagged more freely. Was it a tragic coincidence that he had died so soon after their row? Or had she taken advantage of an opportunity too tempting to resist? Miss Marple requested a short visit, and found Dorothy pale, subdued, yet composed. Her sorrow seemed real, but so did her relief. She answered questions without protest, admitted to the argument, and freely confessed to her resentment. "I never hated him, Miss Marple," she said softly, "but I didn't love him either. I don't think anyone ever did." Miss Marple observed her for a long moment. Dorothy's words carried a strange detachment, more exhaustion than malice. It was the weariness of a life too long lived under another's thumb. She noted it carefully. Motive, perhaps, but murder, real murder, was rarely born of irritation alone. It was a remark from Mrs. Bantry, spoken over a shared tray of crumpets, that nudged Miss Marple's thoughts in an unexpected direction. "I saw Dorothy's young man at the fete," said Mrs. Bantry, lowering her voice. "A very modern-looking fellow. Henry something. He refused the tasting. Said he was allergic to tree nuts." Miss Marple blinked. "Allergic? Oh, yes," said Mrs. Bantry, with a conspiratorial nod. "Apparently the poor boy swells up like a bellows at the mere whiff of a walnut." The detail lodged firmly in Miss Marple's mind. She quietly verified the ingredients in Sir Cedric's dish once more, and confirmed that walnuts had been finely ground and used in the finishing oil for the risotto, part of what gave it its distinctive earthy flavor. If Dorothy had indeed wished harm upon her uncle, it seemed improbable that she would risk poisoning her own fiancé in the process. Henry had been standing nearby, and anyone tampering with the food wouldn't have known who might ultimately taste it. No, this clue had weight. It pointed not only to motive, or lack thereof, but to care. Whoever had altered the dish had been precise, selective, and sure of the intended target. And if Dorothy Redfern wasn't that person, Miss Marple thought, then someone else had wanted the Colonel dead, someone far more calculating. It was several days later, beneath the quiet arch of the churchyard yew trees, that Miss Marple gently engaged Reverend Allerton in conversation once more. This time she asked not about the fate, but about the morning before it. "I believe you and Colonel Redfern had a rather pointed exchange," she remarked with characteristic mildness. The vicar sighed heavily. "I dare say we did. Tobias had discovered that I'd redirected parish funds toward the winter coal allowance. Informal channels, you see. He accused me of misconduct." "Did he threaten to make it public?" "Yes," Allerton admitted. "He said he'd take it up with the bishop. Called me a pious embezzler. I told him he had no idea what it meant to be cold in January with children under your roof." His voice trembled slightly. Not with guilt, Miss Marple thought, but with pride wounded by harsh judgment. "And yet," she said gently, "you kept your distance at the fete." "I had to," he replied. "I knew what it would look like, and I didn't want to give him the satisfaction." There was honesty in his voice, but Miss Marple noted the subtle crack beneath the surface. He had cause to despise the Colonel, and cause to fear exposure. But in her experience, anger born of righteousness rarely translated into murder. Still, a quarrel was a quarrel, and in the game of motives, it was another card on the table. Gresham Hall's kitchen was quieter now. The excitement had long faded, and the scent of saffron and scorched theatrics had been replaced with the everyday aromas of soup stock and yeast. Miss Marple arrived mid-morning, under the pretext of delivering a new scone recipe. Lemon and lavender, a combination she claimed was unfashionably forgotten. The cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Withers, accepted the handwritten note with good humor, and while she prepared a batch of tea for the visiting detective, Miss Marple's eyes took in the layout of the kitchen. Everything was tidy, but it was the spice shelf that caught her attention again. Small jars in a polished wooden rack, alphabetized, labeled in Cedric's neat italic script. She made a remark about the aesthetics, prompting the cook to mention how particular Sir Cedric had been, never allowing anyone near his ingredients without express permission. "He even locked the rack," Mrs. Withers said, "like it was the crown jewels." Miss Marple nodded. "Was it locked on the day of the fete?" The cook hesitated. "It should have been, but I didn't check. Sir Cedric had the key on a chain he wore under his apron." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the tiny lock. Her rack meant to be locked, but somehow its contents had been tampered with, and in a kitchen where every jaw had its place, one tiny change could be all it took to kill a man. Miss Marple waited until late afternoon before speaking again with Millie Dorson. The girl was folding napkins in the back scullery, shoulders drawn in, her face pale beneath her cap. "I always find linen work quite soothing," Miss Marple said conversationally. "All that order and folding, a quiet comfort." Millie glanced up, clearly startled to see her. "Yes, miss." "I've been thinking about the spice rack," Miss Marple continued gently. "It was meant to be locked, wasn't it?" Millie looked down at the napkin she held, twisting it unconsciously. "Sir Cedric always said no one was to touch it. And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "someone did." A long pause followed. Then, without lifting her eyes, Millie whispered, "It was open. The day before the fete. Open." Miss Marple repeated, "Did Sir Cedric leave it that way?" Number Ron? I don't think he knew. I was setting up the trays and I noticed it. The key wasn't in the lock. Did you tell him? I was going to. But then I thought maybe it wasn't my place. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Did you see anyone near it? Millie hesitated again, fingers still. Number. But the salt tin looked different, smaller. It had no label. Miss Marple absorbed this with quiet attention. A spice rack unlocked, a salt container replaced, and only someone observant or frightened would notice such details. You did well to say something, she said, rising. And Millie, never be ashamed of being afraid. It takes great courage to speak once you've been silent. And as she stepped away, Miss Marple knew the silence had spoken volumes. Late that evening, with the house quieter than usual, and Mrs. Withers away visiting her sister, Miss Marple requested a quick glance through Cedric's notes, framed innocently as an interest in the famed chef's philosophy of seasoning. Cedric, still flustered by the ongoing scrutiny, was too distracted to object. He handed her a stack of notebooks, gesturing vaguely to a cluttered shelf where he claimed to keep all my inspirations. Miss Marple flipped through pages filled with flamboyant handwriting, flavor pairings, and dramatic phrases like culinary transcendence and aromatic violence. But one thin notebook, bound in soft brown leather, stood apart, tucked behind a tin of paprika. It bore no title. Its contents, however, were far more restrained. Older recipes, written in a more careful hand. Among them, an early version of the famed risotto della morte. Miss Marple read the list of ingredients: arborio rice, saffron, stock, parmesan, a finishing drizzle of walnut oil, but no nutmeg. And yet, several villagers had commented on a sharp, almost medicinal flavor in the dish. Sir Cedric had denied adding anything beyond his standard blend, but if someone had followed this older recipe from memory, assuming it was still current. Miss Marple closed the book slowly. A forgotten recipe, a missing salt tin, a spice rack unlocked. The killer hadn't needed to create a new dish, only alter one that had changed. Someone had remembered the original version. Someone who had access, someone who wanted the colonel dead, and who believed, fatally, that nutmeg still belonged in the final act. And with that realization, the final pieces began to slide into place. Miss Marple sat quietly that evening in her parlor, knitting untouched in her lap, and a slim medical reference guide open beside her. It had been a gift from her late brother, a chemist by profession, and she had long ago bookmarked a section that had once proved useful in another matter. Nutmeg, Myristica fragrans, commonly used in small quantities as a spice. Ingested in large doses, it could cause hallucinations, nausea, palpitations, and, in rare cases, fatal convulsions. She read the passage 3 times, her mind carefully reviewing the facts. Sir Cedric's current version of the risotto recipe included no nutmeg. The original, now hidden behind a tin, had once contained it. The dish served at the fete had been described as potent, strange, even spicy in a bitter way, and Colonel Redfern had died within minutes of consuming a generous portion. Miss Marple had seen the salt shaker missing, and later, its double, replaced oddly on the wrong side of Cedric's station. The flavor, the reaction, the precise target, these were not the signs of an accidental death, they were deliberate. Nutmeg in heavy quantity was no seasoning, it was poison. Whoever had tampered with the dish had known just enough to be dangerous. Someone who thought they were recreating a recipe, not realizing how deadly a pinch too much could be. It was not arsenic in a wine glass. It was something far subtler, something culinary, something deceptively innocent. And Miss Marple, her eyes resting on the yellowed page before her, now knew precisely what had killed Colonel Redfern. It wasn't the food itself. It was the memory of the wrong recipe, delivered with deadly precision. Miss Marple returned to Gresham Hall's kitchen with the same quiet determination that had solved many a murder in her day. This time she asked Mrs. Withers about the salt. "The salt, my dear?" the cook repeated, puzzled. "We've always had 2 shakers in rotation. The white one with the blue stripes is Sir Cedric's, always on the left." "And the second?" Miss Marple asked with interest. "Oh, the plain one. That's an old shaker. We keep it on the shelf near the flour bins. Hardly used. No label." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the shelf, and there it was. An identical shaker, but plain, unmarked, and currently resting on the right-hand side of the preparation station. The exact place where Cedric had reached during the chaos, claiming he couldn't find his usual salt. She studied it carefully. It was innocuous, harmless seeming, but it wasn't in the right place, and it certainly hadn't been part of Sir Cedric's meticulous layout. "That shaker," she asked gently, "has anyone used it recently?" Mrs. Withers frowned. "Not that I know of. Sir Cedric doesn't like changes. He said seasoning is about instinct and habit." Miss Marple nodded slowly. A second shaker, unlabeled, out of place, introduced by someone who didn't know Cedric's system. The killer hadn't just used nutmeg. They'd hidden it in the most ordinary vessel of all, and in doing so, they'd revealed themselves, because only someone unfamiliar with the chef's habits would place the shaker where it didn't belong. And Miss Marple had taken note of who was watching the risotto table that day, and who wasn't watching what they should have been. Miss Marple was a firm believer that human nature revealed itself in the smallest of routines. How one stirred sugar into tea, the foot they led with down a staircase, even the hand they used to salt a stew. Sir Cedric, as he had stated emphatically, was left-handed. He had arranged his station with precise intention. Ingredients on the left, utensils on the right, sauces center. Muscle memory. He had said, like a dancer, cooking is choreography. And yet, at the fete, the salt had not been where he expected it. He had reached instinctively to the left and found nothing. The shaker had been moved, placed instead on the right. That small misplacement had nearly gone unnoticed, drowned in the chaos of Redfern's collapse. But Miss Marple had seen it, and now, standing again at the culinary tent's stored equipment, she measured the setup in her mind. Someone unfamiliar with Cedric's layout, someone not observant or knowledgeable enough to know he salted with his left hand, had placed the doctored shaker on the wrong side, and that mistake was fatal in more ways than one, because it revealed something more damning than access. It revealed unfamiliarity. Who among the suspects had motive? Several. Who had opportunity? A few. But who had reason to know the recipe, and not the routine? Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the one person who had been in the kitchen, near the ingredients, with reason to remember the old version of the dish, not the revised one. Someone who once watched from the shadows, who had never been taught the rhythm of Cedric's hands. Someone who had made a mistake with the salt, but not with intent. That was the final clue. The threads, now so long entangled, began to weave into a clear, cruel pattern. Miss Marple sat quietly by her window as dusk fell across St. Mary Mead, her knitting untouched in her lap. Her mind replayed Millie's trembling voice, her knowledge of the spice rack, and her comment about the unlabeled salt. A quiet kitchen maid might be overlooked, but not by Miss Marple. Especially not when her eyes spoke volumes. Her words would not. Millie had known the recipe, its original form, not because she'd been told it, but because she had once seen it, perhaps copied it down, perhaps memorized it long ago, when Cedric first arrived at the hall. She had been invisible in the kitchen, and invisible people, Miss Marple knew, often noticed far more than anyone suspected. The spice rack was left unlocked, the salt shaker switched, and nutmeg, harmless in a pinch, deadly in excess, added where it no longer belonged. A dish reborn from memory and grief, not precision. And Colonel Redfern, a man who had fathered a child long ago in secret, a child he had refused to acknowledge, a child who had grown up scrubbing his floors, a child named Millie Dorson. Miss Marple closed her notebook. The risotto hadn't killed a man, but bitterness had. The gathering at Gresham Hall was discreet, yet unmistakably tense. Lady Florence, pale but composed, had agreed to Miss Marple's unusual request. One final clarification. The elderly sleuth had said, "So that we may all sleep peacefully again." And so, on a grey afternoon heavy with silence, the key players were assembled in the drawing room. Sir Cedric, still flushed with indignation; Dorothy Redfern, withdrawn but alert; Reverend Allerton, stiff with unease; and young Millie Dorson, seated quietly near the window, folding and unfolding her apron in her lap. Miss Marple, standing near the hearth as though about to recite a passage of scripture, addressed the room in her usual gentle tone. "I thank you all for indulging an old lady's request," she began. "It may seem impertinent, but I have spent many years in this village, and I've found that the truth, like good bread, rises best when left to prove quietly." No one spoke. Even Sir Cedric, whose dramatic nature might otherwise have resisted the intrusion, remained uncharacteristically still. "Colonel Redfern's death," she continued, "was not the result of age or indigestion. It was a calculated act, cleverly disguised, yes, but not quite cleverly enough." A visible ripple of discomfort passed through the room. "And like all such acts," Miss Marple added with calm finality, "it left behind just enough crumbs to lead us back to the kitchen from which it came." "I should like to begin," said Miss Marple gently, "with the dish itself." She moved with quiet grace to a small side table where she had placed a copy of Sir Cedric's original handwritten recipe, retrieved from behind a tin of paprika, and now flattened beneath a glass paperweight. "This," she said, tapping the page, "is an earlier version of the now famous risotto della morte. Its key distinction from the final version, which Sir Cedric served at the fete, is the inclusion of nutmeg." Sir Cedric frowned. "I haven't used nutmeg in that dish for years. The flavor clashed with the walnut oil. Far too aggressive." "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "But someone who had seen this older version, someone who had perhaps copied or memorized it in the past, might not know of the change. They might assume nutmeg still belonged." There was a pause. She turned to Millie, whose hands had stopped moving. "And so it was added, not as a pinch of spice but in heavy dose, not as seasoning but as poison." Lady Florence gasped. Dorothy paled. "The nutmeg," Miss Marple continued, "was placed inside an unlabeled salt shaker, one kept on a high shelf and ordinarily unused. It was then positioned not to the left, where Sir Cedric always reached, but on the right, where only a someone unfamiliar with his culinary rhythm would think to place it." Sir Cedric blinked. "That's why I reached," and there was nothing. I had to fumble for salt and grabbed whatever was there. Miss Marple nodded. The rest was inevitable. Colonel Redfern took a hearty portion. The others had mere tastings, and thus only one man died. And still, Millie said nothing. Miss Marple stepped forward, her expression unreadable but her tone unwavering. "It takes knowledge," she said quietly, "to know where to find the old recipe. And yet, it takes ignorance to place the salt shaker on the wrong side." She turned once more to Millie, who sat frozen in her chair, her fingers clenched so tightly the knuckles had gone white. "You knew the dish, Millie, not because you helped make it, but because you had watched it, studied it, perhaps even dreamed of cooking it one day, if life had been different." Millie looked up, eyes wide with fear, and something older, something aching. "You also knew that Colonel Redfern was your father," Miss Marple said softly. "He denied you, dismissed you, left your mother in shame and poverty, while he paraded through the village as a man of honor, and you left to scrub his floors in silence." The room remained utterly still. "And so," she finished, "you reached for the only power you had left, not a weapon, but a recipe." Her memory twisted into vengeance. Millie's eyes filled with tears, but her lips did not move. Miss Marple didn't press her. She simply folded her hands. "I've always said," she murmured, "that one can read a great deal from a kitchen, but one reads as far more from the people who live in its shadow." A silence heavier than accusation settled in the drawing room as Miss Marple resumed speaking, her voice gentle but unwavering. "There are things people in villages whisper about," she said. "Things not written down, things remembered by women who worked in houses, who mended linen, and served tea." Her eyes moved to Lady Florence, then to Reverend Allerton, and finally back to Millie. "Many years ago, a young maid, your mother I believe, worked at a nearby estate. She disappeared suddenly, and soon after a new post opened here at Gresham Hall. Nothing was ever said officially, but it was known, quietly, that Colonel Redfern had been involved." Millie's lips trembled. She looked at the floor, eyes brimming with the weight of memory. "He never acknowledged you," Miss Marple continued. "He paid for silence, not support. And while he moved through the village like a pillar of decency, you were left to scrub floors, his floors, listening to his voice, hearing your name unspoken." Lady Florence drew in a breath, her knuckles whitening on the armrest. "But blood," said Miss Marple, "does not need to be spoken aloud to be felt. And neglect, my dear, especially from a father, bruises deeper than most realize." Millie looked up at last, the first tear sliding silently down her cheek. She did not speak. She didn't need to. Miss Marple offered no judgment, only the quiet weight of understanding, the kind that made her more feared than any inspector. For now the truth had found its voice, and in that room it echoed louder than accusation. Millie had a motive unlike any other. Miss Marple said softly, turning her gaze now to the others in the room. "Not money, not fear of scandal, but something more enduring, more corrosive." She paused as if weighing the very word on her tongue. "Resentment." Sir Cedric shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but said nothing. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "this was not a crime of impulse. It was the work of someone who had lived in the shadow of rejection for years, who had endured a life of menial service in the very home where her father dined, lectured, and scolded without once meeting her eyes with recognition. Millie's fingers were motionless now, clasped tightly in her lap. She had the perfect opportunity. Miss Marple went on. She knew Sir Cedric's kitchen routines. She understood where the spices were kept. And she knew the dish, because she had observed it, perhaps even helped prepare it once, back when Sir Cedric first arrived. "Why now?" Lady Florence whispered, voice taut. Miss Marple looked to her, not unkindly. Because the fete was public, because the Colonel's judgment was always loudest when it could humiliate. Perhaps he had threatened her again. Perhaps she simply couldn't bear another day of invisibility. No one spoke. She used what she had, her silence, her knowledge, and the forgotten version of a recipe. Miss Marple's voice dropped slightly. Her daughter's hunger for recognition turned into a dish laced with vengeance. And the tragedy, of course, is that the one thing she craved could never be served cold. It was almost the perfect crime. Miss Marple said, her voice neither gloating nor severe, merely matter-of-fact. So quiet, so plausible, so well-timed. If not for one error, it might have passed as a tragic accident. She turned her gaze toward Millie, who sat like a figure carved from stone. "That error," she said gently, "was nutmeg." Sir Cedric blinked. "I don't use nutmeg anymore. Haven't for at least 2 years." "Exactly." Miss Marple nodded. But someone remembered the dish as it once was, not as it had become. Someone who had seen or copied the original recipe and assumed that nutmeg still played its role. She tapped the brown leather notebook on the table. Millie likely thought she was recreating the chef's masterpiece, spicing it as remembered. But the change had already been made, and with it, the protection from a fatal dose. Sir Cedric looked faintly sick. In that quantity, dear God, it would have overwhelmed everything. The bitterness alone. It did, Miss Marple said quietly. Several guests noted a strange, medicinal flavor, but they only had small bites. The Colonel, however, had a full helping, and so the result was fatal. Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth, and Lady Florence turned away. Miss Marple concluded, if Millie had known the nutmeg had been removed, if she'd consulted the new recipe, she might have failed. But she didn't check, because she trusted her memory more than the man who changed the dish. And in that one oversight, the ghost of the past had betrayed her. The room remained suspended in breathless quiet until, at last, Millie spoke. Her voice was soft, cracked, like something unused in years. "He used to walk past me, every day. He never once looked, never once asked. I used to think, maybe he didn't know. Maybe someone hadn't told him, but he knew." No one interrupted her. "I hated him. I told myself I didn't, but I did. And when I saw him sitting there, smug as ever, laughing at that poor man's risotto like it was a joke, something just broke." She lowered her head. "I found the recipe in his drawer, weeks ago. I remembered how he used to talk about nutmeg. I thought, if I just made it like that, it would be poetic. He'd never know it was me, but he'd know something, somehow." Tears rolled freely now, but she made no sound, no plea, no excuse. Sir Cedric stood as if to speak, then sat again, shaken. Lady Florence rang the bell for the constable in the hall, but her hand trembled. Millie did not resist as they came for her. She simply looked at Miss Marple and whispered, "I didn't mean to kill him. I only meant for him to taste what he left behind." Miss Marple gave no reply. There was nothing left to say. Justice had been served, but not triumphantly, only with the quiet sorrow of a truth too long buried. And as Milly was led away, the room fell again into silence. Not the silence of relief, but the silence of understanding. In the weeks that followed, Lady Florence Gresham became noticeably absent from village life. No invitations were issued, no soirees planned, and the luncheon she had once been so proud to host for the Historical Society was quietly cancelled. The great drawing room of Gresham Hall remained shuttered most days, and Lady Florence, once the animated patroness of poetry readings and seasonal fetes, was now glimpsed only rarely, often walking alone in the rose garden, her parasol tilted downward, as though to shield her not from the sun, but from the weight of social curiosity. There had been no suggestion of guilt, no official censure. Yet the scandal, though brief, had left its mark. In a village like St. Mary Mead, silence could be louder than gossip, and while no one spoke ill of her directly, invitations to tea began to dwindle, and conversations paused momentarily when her name arose. Lady Florence had not committed a crime, but she had hosted a tragedy, and for that, unfair though it might seem, there would be no encore. Miss Marple, observing all from the respectful distance she understood so well, knew that dignity was a fragile thing, and for those who wore it too tightly, even the gentlest scandal could unravel the seams. Sir Cedric Dalloway, though officially cleared of any wrongdoing, did not escape unscathed. His flamboyant style, once charming, now struck many as overwrought. The drama of the fete had attached itself to him like a stubborn stain, no matter how many times he tried to polish it away with wit or indignation. He cancelled his upcoming tour, Culinary Secrets of the Continent, and returned to London with far less fanfare than when he had arrived. The promised cookbook, once billed as a revelation of the senses, was shelved indefinitely. "I shall retreat," he was heard to say, "into soufflés and obscurity." Miss Marple suspected he would recover eventually. The truly vain often did. But for now, he had been reminded, rather sharply, that when one builds a life on flair, even a single misstep can collapse the whole performance. And Sir Cedric had quite literally served the dish that had brought down the curtain. Dorothy Redfern left Gresham Hall with quiet resolve. The scandal had changed little about her day-to-day life. After all, she had never been allowed much of one. But it had opened a door she had long been afraid to walk through. With Henry at her side and a modest travel case in hand, she boarded the morning train to London with no fanfare, no weeping goodbyes, and no backward glance. Miss Marple saw her off at the station. There was no need for words, only a brief, firm handshake and a look of mutual understanding. Dorothy would never speak of Milly again, but the weight of shared grief had a way of softening certain memories, and in time she might find peace, not in forgetting, but in forging something new from the ashes. She had lived in the Colonel's shadow too long. Now, at last, she stepped into her own story. A few days later, Miss Marple sat across from Mrs. Bantry in the sunlit conservatory of the old vicarage, enjoying a pot of her favorite Darjeeling and a plate of thinly sliced seed cake. "Well, Jane," said Mrs. Bantry, dabbing her lips, "you've done it again. I don't know how you always see these things." Miss Marple smiled, stirring her tea with measured grace. "It's not about seeing. It's about noticing. The little things. People overlook them so easily." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "But poison, in a salt shaker. It's like something out of a novel." "Yes." Miss Marple said quietly. But this was no novel. It was desperation, cooked slowly over years of silence. She sipped her tea and added, as if to no one in particular, "People imagine that murder requires fury, or greed, or some grand motive. But it's often much smaller than that. Quiet bitterness, neglect, a life unloved." Mrs. Bantry shook her head. Poor girl. And poor Redfern, even if he was beastly. Miss Marple nodded. Justice was served, I think. But justice is never quite as tidy as people want it to be. She glanced out the window where daffodils nodded gently in the breeze. "And besides," she said softly, "her recipe is a delicate thing. One wrong pinch, and everything can go dreadfully wrong." Spring settled back over St. Mary Mead, like a quilt, bright and quiet and stitched with routine. The fete was spoken of only in cautious whispers now, and the villagers, ever fond of tidy endings, slowly tucked away the memory in drawers lined with lavender. Miss Marple returned to her needlework, to her tea, to her walks past hedgerows heavy with bloom. And though the village was peaceful once more, her mind, ever alert, ever listening, remained sharp as her knitting needles. For in St. Mary Mead, even the gentlest breeze might carry the scent of something stirring. And Miss Marple was always watching. And so, justice was served, not with drama or fury, but with quiet grace, the kind Miss Marple understood better than anyone. In St. Mary Mead, even the most elegant tea party can hide centuries of pain. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the room isn't a weapon, but a memory, buried and bitter. This story wasn't just about a fatal dish or a forgotten spice. It was about the invisible weight people carry when they're never seen, never acknowledged. Millie Dawson didn't kill out of greed or madness. She acted out of silence, the kind that festers across years, until one forgotten page in a cookbook becomes the stage for an unspoken grief. Miss Marple once said that evil rarely arrives with thunderclaps. It walks in softly, dressed like routine. But it's in the small things, missing salt, misremembered habits. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think.